It wasn't in your contract requirements. This story came from an IT coworker who previously worked at a recently expanded data center and was indirectly involved with the legal mess. The data center's company determined that a redundant internet connection was needed and reached out to a few internet service providers with a list of the data center's requirements. One of the service providers underbid the hell out of everyone else. The coworker expressed concerns over that, but management didn't care because the service provider assured them that they would meet all of the requirements. Some long time passed and they heard nothing further from the service provider after the contract was signed. Strange.
As the date of the service start approached, the service provider was asked when they were going to visit the data center for a site survey to start their connection. The service provider requested specifications of the data center's connection infrastructure to the internet. Data center said they had no redundant fiber connections and they were expecting the service provider to do the installation work. The email response from the service provider included new people in the email chain. Turns out the requirement didn't specifically state that the service provider had to build the cable infrastructure to connect the data center. The service provider's legal team insisted that the contract only required the service provider to allow the data center to access the internet, and the service provider assumed the data center already had the physical infrastructure in place for the tap to be turned on. When the company pushed to have the contract cancelled, the service provider's legal team insisted that the company had already agreed to a one-year contract and they would pay up full even if they couldn't use the internet due to the lack of cables. The outcome of the hostile closed-door negotiations was that the company backed out of the contract by paying the service provider a sum of money that was equivalent to a few months of service, and restart the bidding, this time with the requirements significantly rewritten.
When the same service provider put their offer in again, for some reason it was rejected immediately.
When the same service provider put their offer in again. Not as stupid as it sounds. In plenty of such cases the people assessing the bids aren't going to be ones who were aware of the previous legal fight. Or there's going to be an ironclad policy about choosing the lowest bidder. If the bidder was just a fraction less lazy, they could have added a doing business as alias and submitted the bid under the new name, to see if that would slip under the radar.
That's what happens when the group preparing the statement of work isn't specific.
So many lessons here. I spent 20 years as a sourcing MGR VP. Any bid that came in markedly lower than all other bids was an automatic location flag. Buyers had standing orders to elevate such bids to me, with their research explaining why they thought the bid was legit or not. I did not push them in either direction. I wanted real assessments. In almost every case, it turned out the bidder hadn't understood the scope. I can't recall an instance where management above me second-guessed a sourcing recommendation to ignore such a bid. Lesson: if you have good people and procedures, trust them. If you don't, why not? At my current company, any non-standard SOW must be reviewed, approved by our technical team. They have a person permanently assigned to such reviews. And by legal, it then goes to the senior contract MGR, me, for final review before inclusion in a proposal contract. At least 3 sets of eyes have looked at it. I'm not a tech guy, but the lack of completeness in the OP's SOW would jump out at me. Lesson: when reviewing any doc, ask yourself what matters aren't being addressed that should be. It's treacherously easy to overlook something that isn't there. This is why we have checklists. That this escalated to a dispute is understandable. That it got ugly is not. The supplier won a few months' revenue. In exchange, they permanently poisoned their relationship with a customer over an honest mistake. They also risked poisoning their reputation with other customers. Stories like this always make the rounds, not on paper, but people will know. Stuff like this gets shared on the golf course. With names. They should have just asked to be terminated for convenience and waived any compensation not already paid. Nobody loses. The buyer destroyed a supplier relationship for no good purpose. The SOW was incomplete. What's so hard about saying, "I'm sorry"? We gave you incomplete specs and we have a misunderstanding. How do we fix this? From there, a solution can be found. Did they really think they were going to get free infrastructure? The buyer now has a reputation of being unreasonable, impossible to walk with. Those stories get shared on the golf course too. Both companies are apparently managed by toxic, self-destructive idiots. Lesson: don't work for those kinds of people. Statement of works written by a PM and not a tech. I ended up on one that said that reaching 5% of backup job failures incurred a penalty. So, as an outsourcer, we moved to a tool that counted each file system as a job, not each host. Not specified in contract. A 5% failure of 111k jobs was not something we would ever reach. I fixed this when I was insourced. I worked at an organization in Germany which was more or less split into operations and everything else. I did some work for the operations side but was mostly on everything else. The guy in charge of the networking and telecommunications for operations put out a tender with really demanding service levels, which were not derived from a business need. Large telecommunication companies will have a certain suite of products. With defined service levels, they aren't going to make up something special unless the client is huge and our organization was small. So, the major players submitted bids that did not meet the ridiculously high service levels, but some local firm put in a very expensive bid that met all the requirements. The operations network manager was keen for the organization to accept this bid, but I pointed out that this small firm was simply reselling a standard product from the largest telco, and the extra money in their pricing was to cover the penalties that they would pay whenever they failed to meet the service requirements.
They were gambling on the large telco's service not having outages very often. Personally, I think this was a brown envelope situation which didn't pay out.
I worked for a company that had a server that backed up important information from other servers, etc. I was a mainframe operations supervisor, so didn't have any ownership of the service, but my staff worked all 3 shifts, so did things like changing the tapes, etc. The server started to have problems which affected the CE0 among others, and they started up a replacement project that was taking up all the time of the person responsible for the backup system. My boss asked if I could take over the day-to-day of the current system while it was replaced, because I was his go-to problem solver. I started by learning what was needed to fix the system in the middle of the night so the CEO could connect when he came in. I trained my operators and gave them on-call support if needed. Then I went further and read the docs and figured out why it was having the problem. A simple scheduling issue. And fixed that. Then my boss asked me to help out on the replacement project because they couldn't get it to work at all. Okay. Went to meetings, figured out what was going on, and discovered that the hardware they bought was incompatible with the software they bought, and it was never going to work. I shared this with my boss and worked with our purchasing department to get the $500,000 refunded. The only thing that saved us was the vendor we bought from had sold us both products and was assisting on the project. And that's why you do a survey of requirements in the area. If relevant, then work off that when making the contract. If it's not in the contract, it didn't happen. To be fair, this is actually a somewhat common practice. ISP provides transit to the internet and you use your own infrastructure to get to the nearest POP that ISP operates out of. So maybe you have fiber ran to Equinix 350E Cermak Chicago and buy transit from multiple providers there because a ton of transit there is cheaper.
Lumen?
Reminds me of my university. They paid lots of money to have 2 independent, redundant connections to the web of wide worlds. How independent these two really were got literally unearthed when roadwork accidentally cut both cables, lying in the ground right next to each other. I'm red in the face now, for palming it so hard. Several times. First with my hand, then my keyboard. My desk followed, as did a chair. Lol, I guess they found out the reason why they were able to underbid. Yep. Saw this kind of thing often when I worked for a couple government contracting companies. I ended up quitting one of those contractors when it started trying to take advantage, similar to the OP's story. That contractor went bankrupt after it got blacklisted. The company shouldn't have had to pay a penalty. There was clearly not a meeting of the minds over the meaning of contract, meaning that the contract was never actually formed and the paper was worthless.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Aircast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.